Do you found the skeleton? How would you tell it represents you personally? How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. When last we left off, we learned that Sanford didn't understand taphonomy, coelacanths, evolution, or Lazarus taxa, which should be surprising, but honestly, he's a young Earth creationist, so it's not. Also, I'm doing an experiment with this video, where I'm doing a feather pattern on my Dapper Zord. In part because this is supposed to be a feather video, but also I need to save a few points on my render farm. If you're interested in helping with that, stay tuned. Anyway, let's listen to Sanford get the fossil record wrong.
So it's just a really wonderful illustration of how wrong the fossil can be.
It's a wonderful example of how wrong the fossils can be. Let's be generous and add in the word record there. So it's a wonderful example of how wrong the fossil record can be. What's wrong about it? The fossil record is just all the fossils that have been found. The coelacanth is a Lazarus taxon, which is to say a taxon whose fossil record disappears at some point, only for them to show back up later in the fossil record, or today. This is a well-known phenomenon, and it is expected, unless Sanford here wants to argue that the fossil record contains all individual species ever to have lived on Earth, which I doubt he would.
But before I tell you about how Darwin was wrong about the fossil record, I'd like to tell you something he was right about, and that was that he fully recognized that the fossil record of his day falsified his theory.
No, it didn't. It just failed to sufficiently support it.
So he says that in three places. The first one is he acknowledges the importance of the Cambrian explosion. He says, to question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earlier periods before the Cambrian, I can give no satisfactory answer.
So in order for this to matter, we'd have to show that, to this day, no Precambrian fossils of complex organisms that are nonetheless less complex than Cambrian organisms exist. Well, too bad the Ediacaran fossils exist, which are also sometimes called the Vendian biota, with organisms like Charnia, Namacalathus, Dickinsonia, Spergina, and Kimberella.
He understood that the sudden emergence of life in the Cambrian did not fit his model, and there was no precursors that could have evolved into all those life forms.
Good thing we know that the origin of life was billions of years earlier, and we have fossils from billions of years ago, and that the Ediacaran does provide fossils of animals that fit the bill of being precursors to at least some Cambrian animals. It seems like this problem was basically solved, and solved as predicted by Darwin by just finding more fossils. Has every mystery about the beginning of the Cambrian been solved? No, but then there's no reason to say that if anything remains unknown about a subject, then what is known must be tossed out. That's absurd. With that standard, we would have to toss out literally all knowledge about anything.
Furthermore, he acknowledges stasis, which means that life forms stay the same throughout the geological column. And so here's what he says. He says the most eminent paleontologists, and he then lists the most eminent paleontologists of his time, and our greatest geologists, and he lists the greatest geologists of his time, have unanimously, often vehemently maintained the immutability of species.
I think it's worth quoting this whole paragraph in full. It's the last paragraph in Chapter 9 of the 6th edition and reads as follows. Several difficulties here discussed, namely, that though we find in our geological formation many links between the species which now exist and formerly existed, we do not find infinitely numerous fine transitional forms closely joining them all together. The sudden manner in which several groups of species first appear in our European formations, the almost entire absence, as at present known, of formations rich in fossils beneath the Cambrian strata, are all undoubtedly of the most serious nature. We see this in the fact that the most eminent paleontologists, namely Cuvier, Agassiz, Barrand, Pictet, Falconer, E. Forbes, etc., and all our greatest geologists, such as Lyell, Murchison, Sedgwick, etc., have unanimously, often vehemently, maintained the immutability of species. But Sir Charles Lyell now gives the support of his high authority to the opposite side, and most geologists and paleontologists are much shaken in their former belief. Those who believe that the geological record is in any degree perfect will undoubtedly at once reject my theory. For my part, following out Lyell's metaphor, I look at the geological record as a history of the world imperfectly kept and written in a changing dialect. Of this history, we possess the last volume alone, relating only to 2 or 3 countries. Of this volume, only here and there a short chapter has been preserved, and of each page, only here and there a few lines. Each word of the slowly changing language, more or less different in the successive chapters, may represent the forms of life which are entombed in our consecutive formations, and which falsely appear to have been abruptly introduced. On this view, the difficulties above discussed are greatly diminished or even disappear. Yeah, see, the thing is, Sanford is dishonestly quoting from the first edition. By the time of the 6th edition, some 13 years later, all these prominent geologists holding on to their idea of species fixity were not so sure anymore, since the transitional forms had been found. See what I mean about Sanford being hard to take as an honest person?
I actually didn't, this was really interesting for me to read because it means, I thought that the Christians were talking about the immutability of species, but it was the geologists.
Before the final edition, yeah, go on.
Looking at the fossil record that made them realize that in deep time, or living types of animals did not change. They stayed the same.
Think he's going to mention that some 13 years after the version he read, that the geologists were reversing course on that? I'm betting no.
That doesn't mean that small changes in adaptation don't happen, but it means that...
Actually, no, it does not mean that small adaptations don't happen. That's what species fixity means, and that's what, at the time of the publishing of the first edition of Origin of Species, geologists believed. Sanford is just trying to make it look like they agreed with him, when in fact they never did. This idea of Noah taking a small number of kinds, which then evolve into modern diversity, is a new idea, and no one before the mid-20th century had ever heard of it. The geologists of 1859 would all find Sanford's ideas even crazier than Darwin's.
The geological record didn't support evolution.
Funny how those same geologists thought it might very well support it in 1872, though, isn't it? And that is a trend that has not reversed since then. We basically have an unbroken chain of geology supporting evolution more and more from 1859.
And so, most importantly, Darwin describes this problem. He knows that evolution must happen slowly and gradually over lots of time.
Well, gradualism was indeed one of Darwin's ideas, and while we can see gradualism in some lineages, like ceratopsians, sea sloths, and to some degree humans, in other lineages, interspecific gradualism is harder to detect, while changes between higher taxa are easier to detect. This is why punctuated equilibrium was added to modern evolutionary theory.
And so the fossil record should show that. So he asks, why then is not every geological stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against my theory. That's what he's saying.
This is from paragraph 1 of chapter 9 of the first edition. Let's check out the 6th edition to see where Darwin and geology were by the time he was done updating his book. Chapter numbers in this edition vary a bit from the first edition, so we're now in chapter 10, but it's the same chapter, on the imperfection of the geological record. The first paragraph reads as follows. In the 6th chapter, I enumerated the chief objections which might be justly urged against the views maintained in this volume, most of which have now been discussed. 1, namely the distinctness of specific forms, and their not being blended together by innumerable transitional links, is a very obvious difficulty. I assigned reasons why such links do not commonly occur at the present day under the circumstances apparently most favorable for their presence, namely on an extensive and continuous area with graduated physical conditions. I endeavored to show that the life of each species depends in a more important manner on the presence of other already defined organic forms than on climate, and therefore that the really governing conditions of life do not graduate away quite insensibly like heat or moisture. I endeavored also to show that the intermediate varieties, from existing in lesser number than the forms which they connect, will generally be beaten out and exterminated during the course of further modification and improvement. The main cause, however, of innumerable intermediate links not now occurring everywhere throughout nature depends on the very process of natural selection, through which new varieties continually take the places of and supplant their parent forms. But just in proportion to this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which must have formerly existed be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation in every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Okay, so now we know what Darwin was saying in the first paragraph, but remember, this is the same edition where he ends this very chapter with Darwin pointing out that geologists are being forced to abandon species fixity. This paragraph is like the first paragraph in an abstract. It's here to set up the problem so that the rest of the chapter, which is about fixing the problem or showing why it isn't one, has context.
So, but he doesn't give up, obviously, and so he has a solution to his problem. Here's the solution. The explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. In other words, give us more time and we'll find the missing links. So Darwin was absolutely wrong when he predicted that the fossil record, when complete, would support his theory.
Let's remind ourselves of how this chapter ends. All our greatest geologists have unanimously, often vehemently, maintained the immutability of species, but Sir Charles Lyell now gives the support of his high authority to the opposite side, and most geologists and paleontologists are much shaken in their former belief. And why did this change? Well, because intermediate organisms were found. Those missing links were not all missing. Indeed, in 1861, years before the final edition of Origin of Species, Archaeopteryx was discovered, and despite Richard Owen's whining and outright lies and false predictions about it, it was obviously a transition between what was then thought of as reptiles and what was then thought of as birds. It had unfused wing fingers, unfused metatarsals, a long bony tail, no beak, teeth. Its sternum didn't have a keel, its pubic bones came together under the ischial bones. Yet, for all that this made it look like a member of the only recently defined group Dinosauria, it also had feathers, and feathers are a trademark of birds. Since then, we haven't been stagnant in finding transitional forms. In fact, I think it's time for a montage.
And so 150 years later, what is the total fossil count? There are too many fossils that have been collected to even calculate, perhaps billions.
Oh, it's way more than billions. Organic limestone is made up of microscopic fossils, so collecting 1 cubic centimeter of limestone yields you about 4.5 million fossils, assuming that all of the fossils are at the high end of the size for coccolithophores, of 75 micrometers in diameter. You might not be shocked to know that the evolution of organisms like coccolithophores, which are single-celled eukaryotic phytoplankton, is easily traced through the sediment and in fact does yield what Darwin might call a finely graduated organic chain.
There are roughly 250 million cataloged fossils, and according to a paper in Nature talking about the completeness of the fossil record, there is plenty of evidence now, plenty of fossils that have been recovered so that we do see the true and complete picture.
Is that what it says? Because that paper only sampled the most common marine groups, which I will list exhaustively: Anthozoa, Asterozoa, Bivalvia, Brachiopoda, Birozoa, Cephalopoda, Chondrichthyes, Crinoidea, Echinoidea, Gastropoda, Malacostraca, Ostracoda, Polychaeta, and Porifera. Notice that there are no tetrapods, no plants, not even any bony fish. This is a study about the completeness of the marine fossil record, mostly of invertebrate animals, but the completeness measures from about 5% chance of any given polychaete genus being preserved to an over 90% chance of any brachiopod being preserved. And wouldn't you know it, we have a lot of wonderful transitional forms of brachiopods, but creationists don't care about brachiopods, because first, they can't usually tell the difference between them and bivalves, and second, they're not cool animals that you see at the zoo like lions or tigers. But other well-preserved lineages include Bivalvia and Bryozoa, while Malacostraca and Asterozoa are in the range where the vast majority of genera should be completely missing from the fossil record. This paper in no way says what Dr. Sanford says it does, that we have a complete fossil record. Sure, we have a basically complete brachiopod fossil record, but we definitely have a very incomplete record in other cases. But do we have enough to see the big picture? Well, yes, I think we do. And the thing is, so do most paleontologists. It's just that the essentially universal consensus is that it's fully in line with common ancestry and evolution. And no one, Sanford included, seems to come up with the anti-evolution idea based on the evidence, only to find that, to their surprise, that puts them in league with the Christians. Instead, they find themselves having a conversion experience and then finding that their interpretation of Christianity is incompatible with the evidence-based ideas from science, and so deciding that their religion is more important than the actual evidence. So then they move away from evidence-based science and into pseudoscience.
On the grand scale. And the picture is not what Darwin needed.
Do I really need to do it again? Okay, I guess I do, but we'll speed it up this time.
So let's just look at two quotes that illustrate this. Stephen Jay Gould, the famous evolutionist and paleontologist, says the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the fossil record.
Oh hey look, little Johnny found a Stephen Jay Gould quote mine, and from 1977 too. Since this is more than 4 decades old, let's just quote talk origins, as if Sanford thinks that 40-year-old plus quotes are a great idea, I think 10-plus-year-old debunks are sufficient. A more complete quote would be as follows. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Yet Darwin was so wedded to gradualism that he wagered his entire theory on a denial of this literal record. The geological record is extremely imperfect, and this fact will to a large extent explain why we do not find interminable varieties connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. He who rejects these views on the nature of geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. Darwin's argument persists as a favorite escape of most paleontologists from the embarrassment of a fossil record that seems to show so little of evolution directly. In exposing its cultural and methodological roots, I wish in no way to impugn on the potential validity of gradualism, for all general views have similar roots. I only wish to point out that it is never seen in the rocks. Paleontologists have paid an exorbitant price for Darwin's argument. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. For several years, Niles Eldredge of the American Museum of Natural History and I, that is Stephen Jay Gould, have been advocating a resolution to this uncomfortable paradox that does not require gradual change. In fact, the operation of Charles Darwin's process should yield exactly what we see in the fossil record. It is gradualism we should reject, not Darwinism. So it would seem that Gould had no problems with the fossil record, but did he believe that transitional forms are lacking? Note that in the quote originally presented, the claim is made that they are rare, not absent. Also, as anyone who is familiar with Gould's writings will know, the text quoted reflects his recognition that, while there is a scarcity of transitional fossils between species, there is no such lack of transitional fossils between major groups. Yet again, this is Gould discussing punctuated equilibria. It is best, perhaps, simply to allow Gould to defend himself as he did in his article Evolution as Fact and Theory, originally published in 1981. Quote, transitions are often found in the fossil record. Preserved transitions are not common and should not be, according to our understanding of evolution, see next section, but they are not entirely wanting, as creationists often claim. He then discusses 2 examples, therapsid intermediaries between reptiles and mammals, and the half-dozen human species, found as of 1981, that appear in an unbroken temporal sequence as progressively more modern features. Faced with these facts of evolution and the philosophical bankruptcy of their own position, creationists rely upon distortion and innuendo to buttress their rhetorical claim. If I sound sharp or bitter, indeed I am, for I have become a major target of these practices. I count myself among the evolutionists who argue for a jerky or episodic rather than a smoothly gradual pace of change. In 1972, my colleague Niles Eldredge and I developed the theory of punctuated equilibrium. We argued that 2 outstanding facts of the fossil record, geologically sudden origin of new species, and failure to change thereafter, stasis, reflect the predictions of evolutionary theory, not the imperfections of the fossil record. In most theories, small isolated populations are the source of new species, and the process of speciation takes thousands or tens of thousands of years. This amount of time, so long when measured against our lives, is a geological microsecond. Since we propose punctuated equilibria to explain trends, it is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists, whether through design or stupidity, I do not know, as admitting that the fossil record includes no transitional forms. Transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level, but they are abundant between larger groups. End quote. That's from Gould, Stephen J., 1983, Evolution as Fact and Theory, in Hen's Teeth and Horse's Toes, Further Reflections on Natural History, New York, W. W. Norton and Company, page 258 through 260. Gould, in this article and in many more over the next 20 years, consistently and extensively explained his position and the evidence for evolution, including transitional forms found in the fossil record. The constant abuse of the body of Gould's life work in the face of this is not merely dishonest, it is despicable. And all of that was written by John Catshark Puree and John Augrey Barber between 2004 and 2006. So a question I would have for Dr. Sanford, or for Sal by proxy, is why is Dr. Sanford dishonestly quoting Stephen Jay Gould to imply that he thought that the fossil record did not support evolution?
That's a pretty strong statement that there's no missing links.
Except that you know that that's a damn lie, Sanford. I'll be honest, given Sanford's credentials and in the high regard he's held in by creationists, I figured he would be a cut above. I thought that this talk would actually make me have to really dig. Instead, no, we get the same disgusting, dishonest drivel that we get from people like Ken Ham. Why does a Cornell professor think it's okay to flat out lie about a scientist? Why does Sal speak so highly of this man? I guess it's at least comforting to know that the rule that you can only be at most two among honest, well-informed, and creationist holds true, and that Sanford is well-informed, creationist, but clearly not honest.
And again, Eldridge and Tattersall, two famous evolutionists, they say 120 years of paleontological research later, it has become abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions.
Oh, fun! Another quote mine from people who definitely think that the fossil record supports evolution. Well, since this is still ancient, back to talk origins. In the passages quoted, Eldridge and Tattersall are discussing the merits of gradualism, something the quote miner has left out, as we can see. Quote, the main impetus for expanding the view that species are discrete at any one point in time to embrace their entire life history comes from the fossil record. Paleontologists just were not seeing the expected changes in their fossils as they pursued them up through the rock record. Instead, collections of nearly identical specimens, separated in some cases by 5 million years, suggested that the overwhelming majority of animal and plant species were tremendously conservative throughout their histories. That individual kinds of fossils remained recognizably the same throughout the length of their occurrence in the fossil record had been known to paleontologists long before Darwin published his Origin. Darwin himself, troubled by the stubbornness of the fossil record and refusing to yield abundant examples of gradual change, devoted 2 chapters to the fossil record. To preserve his argument, he was forced to assert the fossil record was too incomplete, too full of gaps to produce the expected pattern of change. He prophesied that future generations of paleontologists would fill in these gaps by diligent search, and then his major thesis that evolutionary change is gradual and progressive would be vindicated. 120 years of paleontological research later, it has become abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record. The fossil record simply shows that his prediction is wrong. The observation that species are amazingly conservative and static entities throughout long periods of time has all the qualities of the emperor's new clothes. Everyone knew it, but preferred to ignore it. Paleontologists, faced with a recalcitrant record, obstinately refusing to yield to Darwin's predicted pattern, simply looked the other way. Rather than change the well-entrenched evolutionary theory, paleontologists tacitly agreed with their zoological colleagues that the fossil record was too poor to do much beyond supporting, in a general sort of way, the basic thesis that life has evolved. Note the claim that the fossil record supports evolution. This again is from John Augrey Puree between 2003 and 2005. So again, we're just arguing against Darwinian gradualism, and both Eldridge and Tattersall agree that the fossil record supports evolution on the whole, and of course, as advocates for punctuated equilibrium, they are overstating the completeness of the fossil record and understating the prevalence of transitionals, which is why now the consensus is that there is some merit to punctuated equilibrium, but that gradualism is also observed in some lineages.
So guess what? The thing that Darwin considered the best evidence against his theory still is the best evidence against his theory.
According to none of the 5 people referenced. I can't stress this enough. He quoted from the work of 5 different authors in 3 different works to say that the fossil record doesn't support evolution, and none of them say that evolution isn't supported by the fossil record. Literally, none of them. Hey, you know what Psalm 14:1 says? It says, there is no God. Deuteronomy 32:39 says, "There is no God with me." 1 Kings 8:23 also says there is no God. 2 Kings 1:6 says there is no God in Israel. 2 Chronicles 6:14 also says there is no God. Psalm 3:3 says there is no help in God. Psalm 53:1 says there is no God. Isaiah 44:6 says there is no God. Isaiah 45:5 says there is no God. Isaiah 45:21 again says there is no God. Hosea 4:1 says there is no truth. Hosea 13:4 says there is no Savior. Micah 3:7 says there is no answer of God. Clearly, Christianity, which is a theistic religion, can't be right because even its own holy book says that there is no God, there is no truth, and there is no Savior. But Christianity thinks that Jesus is God, truth, and Savior. Except, oh wait, none of those verses actually say that in context. All of those verses do contain those words in that order in the KJV, but I had to slog through hundreds of verses I couldn't quote mine, and even the ones I could all actually say the opposite of the small bits I pulled out of them. In fact, in most of them, the character saying, "There is no God," is actually God, and he follows up with something like, "Besides me." Can you see, creationists, why maybe this isn't a good tactic? Maybe being so blatantly dishonest doesn't really make people want to join your religion if it's inspiring such behavior.
So now what we have is on the left, we have the actual fossil record,
What's the source for this? Right, he made it up.
which shows no cross-linking between kinds and no common ancestor.
Actually, as the quotes that we were given show, the fossil record actually does show links between higher taxa. That is, taxa like families and higher. What it doesn't tend to show is transitions between species in the same genus or family. You know, the only kind of evolution Sanford accepts. So far from being a problem for evolution, this is a problem for young Earth creationism.
And we see stasis through the entire geological column, suggesting that things don't evolve, they stay the same.
Literally the opposite conclusion made by every single source we've been given here. And of course, it's that time again. So yeah, not sure how we're going to conclude that the fossil record, which is chock full of transitions, just not always the ones that a gradualist would want, is not a support for evolution. Of course, I also look forward to Sanford's attempt to explain the fossil record using a flood.
And on the right, we have what Darwin was speculating would have happened, what he was hoping the fossil record would show, and what the fossil record fails to show.
Yeah, gradualism in a complete fossil record. But we know that gradualism is not always a good assumption, and from the very source that Sanford used to say that the fossil record is complete, we know it's not, at least not for all taxa.
And so this is a huge problem for Darwin.
Maybe, but is it a problem for modern evolutionary theory? You know, the thing that doesn't care about Darwin? No, it's not.
Darwin was wrong about the tree of life. And so for this icon, we selected a page from Darwin's notebook where he scribbled the words, "I think," and then a little cartoon with branches, which is his version of the tree of life.
Why use the word cartoon here? Let's look at the basic definition for a cartoon from Wikipedia, because we can be fairly certain that what's there is going to be just what most English speakers think a cartoon is. Quote, "A cartoon is a type of visual art that is typically drawn, frequently animated, in unrealistic or semi-realistic style. The specific meaning has evolved over time, but the modern usage usually refers to either an image or series of images intended for satire, caricature, or humor, or a motion picture that relies on a sequence of illustrations for its animation." End quote. I'm pretty sure that this single image isn't intended for satire, caricature, or humor, and it's certainly not a motion picture. So the only reason I can see to call this a cartoon is to poison the well. Also note that when Sanford made up a diagram from whole cloth, he did not call it a cartoon.
Now, when I was an evolutionist, I would have said this was one of the best evidences for evolution, the tree of life.
Hopefully he means like the actual evident common ancestry that all life on Earth shares, and not Darwin's sketch of an idea from a notebook.
Let's consider it. Let's go back to this picture again. The actual fossil record doesn't show a tree, does it?
I think he means let's go back to this cartoon he made up one day, and what would it look like for the fossil record to show a tree? These cartoons, because that's how I'm going to start referring to anything he puts up but doesn't cite, are based on charts showing different kinds of data, so just the comparison is dishonest. The one on the left looks like a chart that shows the geological and therefore temporal range of various taxa. Each red line would be some taxon with a name, and no matter if it changes or not, it would just be a red line with some vertical extent. In fact, all taxa do change throughout time, but this chart is fundamentally unable to show this. In fact, actual charts like this don't have any morphology access. They don't technically have an x-axis. Instead, it's just a list of taxa in some order. Sometimes they're arranged the way they might have been in a cladogram, but other times they're just alphabetical or some other way of arranging them. The chart on the right is basically a cladogram showing an approximation of morphological diversity and the approximate extent of the taxa. But the problem is that on these charts, you can't actually put numbers on the axes, in no small part because you can't measure morphology one-dimensionally. You need far more dimensions than you could ever reasonably display to put morphology orthogonal to time. And with cladograms, the node points are not named taxa, because cladistic analysis and phylogenetic analysis both start with the assumption that all taxa under consideration are endpoints, and then they generate the most well-supported tree according to various criteria, such as fewest branch numbers, parsimony, etc. Pretending that these are something you can compare with no source and without even explaining what charts like this are supposed to show is just dishonest.
But we need a tree. So if you're a committed Darwinist and you realize the fossil record's not going to help you, you're going to have to find another way to show evidence for this tree of life with a single common ancestor.
Well, it's going to help, but it's only one line of evidence. There is also the genetics that shows quite conclusively that all life forms whose genomes we've studied share common ancestry.
How do you do that? Well, there's a science called phylogeny, and perhaps Darwin's tree of life might be saved through the science of phylogeny. What does that mean?
Yep, it can. Because if organisms did not have a common ancestor, we can predict what a phylogenetic analysis would recover for that group of organisms that lacks a common ancestor. Let's see if it's actually mentioned.
It means that you make observations of all the living species.
Nope, phylogenetic analysis is done on extinct species too, but it's not normally done on my subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do so, lest you be the subject of phylogenetic analysis. And if you want to help me get my animations done quickly, just go to sheep@renderfarm.com, go to the Get Started page, download the client appropriate to your operating system, use the login credentials in the description of this video, and you'll be rendering on my behalf. Do be aware that this will cost extra electricity, so if your power bill is a concern, perhaps give this a pass. Also, be aware that the password isn't my password, it's a public key, so it won't give you access to any of my accounts.
Which represent the top of that tree.
Nope. You would include the branches that terminate before the top of the tree if possible, because there's no requirement that all taxa in question be extant.
And then you use the similarities and differences between living species to infer or guess how the branching structure might have been.
No, it's not a guess. You don't just eyeball it. There are actual rigorous mathematical measurements and statistics to be run. In fact, the same way that evolutionary biology determines the relationship between larger taxa are used by creationists to determine the relationships within what they think of as kinds. The same way a creationist would try to determine that wolves, coyotes, golden jackals, and maned wolves have a common ancestor, shows just as well that wolves, bears, seals, and raccoons have a common ancestor, or that wolves, pangolins, horses, and cows do too.
Okay, so the idea of phylogeny is anything, the stuff in your kitchen, the stuff in your garage, your wardrobe, all things can be grouped naturally based upon their similarities and differences.
No, that's not the idea, and he damn well knows that. Phylogeny is based on the idea of derived differences, and the absolute brute fact that we know from genetics that when you inherit genes from ancestors, it carries with it the traits associated with those genes, and the changes in a lineage are inherited by descendants within that lineage. This is true for living things and not true for inanimate objects.
And so phylogeny is this attempt to infer the past based upon modern-day similarities.
And past similarities, because again, extinct organisms aren't excluded.
And the bottom line is, You can't know the past by looking at just what's alive today.
Actually, you can, at least in part. And we don't look only at the present, but yeah, if you can't infer the past by looking at today, then I guess all of history and forensic science, but also the Bible, are useless to determining what happened in the past. Luckily for everyone, including Christians, that's not how anything works.
So the early phylogenies, or trees of life, were just fanciful cartoons.
Ah yes, once again using the word cartoon to poison the well, as if stylizing these charts for layfolk somehow invalidates them.
So they were just, well, it seems to me that birds should be on one branch and mammals should be on another branch and amphibians should be on a branch. And so they'd make these fanciful cartoons. And
that was back in the 19th century. And here in the 21st century, we actually base this on rigorous studies including fossil information, DNA, rigorous statistical analyses, etc. So criticism of these non-rigorous drawings from more than a century ago to our current understanding of phylogenetics is either stupid beyond comprehension, or it's entirely dishonest. Hey Sal, once again, if you're watching this, please let me know why your pal is doing this.
And as time passed, the cartoons got more and more stylized, and they called them cladograms.
I'm sorry, what's the deal with being stylized? And cladograms aren't exactly the same thing as phylogenies, but it's close enough that I'm not going to nitpick here. Also, how is that last chart more stylized than the ones that used actual trees?
What you see is we have living things on the top, and we have lines down the bottom. The living things are things we actually observe. The lines are things we imagine.
We imagine in the same way we imagine protons. You can't go grab a jar of protons. You can't look at them. You can't say what color they are or how they taste. But their existence is clear from the effect they have on the world that we can detect, and their presence is the only thing that makes sense of our observations about atoms. Similarly, the existence of common ancestors isn't something you can usually go out and take a picture of, except in cases of very recent speciation events. But their presence is seen in things like the pattern of inherited neutral variation, the distribution of both homologies and analogies, the transitional forms we do indeed have in the fossil record, etc. Their existence is the only thing that makes sense of the data we have about living organisms. As Theodosius Dobzhansky once said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution.
So you can maybe see that you could draw other branching structures beneath the living things.
You could, but they wouldn't make sense, except in the case of swapping out the mouse and the chimp, since those are the only two branches on this whole chart that are sisters to each other. So let's swap some. I'm a nerd, so I have some d8s handy, and there are 7 options, so I'll roll a pair of d8s 4 times, and I'll re-roll if I get doubles, 8s, or 7 and 8, since that's a trivial swap. The results are 5, 1, 7, 3, 3, 2, 1, 4. So first, that's swapping the pigeon and the hagfish, then the chimp and the perch, then the salamander and the perch, and finally the hagfish and the lizard. Now for this exercise, I'm going to go with the wider taxa. So hagfish will be agnathan fish, perch will be actinopterygian fish, the salamander will be Lissamphibia, the lizard will be squamates, the pigeon will be dinosaurs, the mouse will be rodents, and the chimp will be primates. Now the first thing to note is the diagram is actually wrong. It should be like this, with the lizard and the pigeon sharing a common ancestor, since pigeons are closer to lizards than either are to mice. And believe it or not, this is the most high quality version of this cladogram I could find, despite the dither. So anyway, let's do this. First, correct the error with pigeons and lizards. Okay, now that that's done, let's look at swapping birds and jawless fish. Well, this would be a very strange hypothesis, with the hagfish being more like a lizard than a lizard is like a mouse. The hagfish, which doesn't have bones, a jaw, which has gills, is clearly not very much like a lizard. Whereas for the bird to be the outgroup, we would have to assume that it independently evolved 4 limbs, lungs, a jaw, etc., and that those just happen to match the embryological development of all the other animals except the hagfish, which must have lost all those things independently. That's clearly a worse option. Well, maybe swapping primates and lissamphibians will do better. So here at least we have all of our animals being able to share the development of lungs, a spine, and jaws. But we also have some problems. Hagfish and perch have larval stages almost exactly like that of the salamander, whereas the chimps, lizards, and pigeons, and mice all have amniotic development with no larval stage that is free living. Further, both the mouse and the chimp share fur, mammary glands, placental reproduction, dentary, squamosal jaw joints, etc., etc., etc. So the implication here would be that chimps and mice independently derived all of the features of mammals. Clearly, this seems wrong, so let's not assume that one. Next, we'll see how we do with switching the perch and the salamander. Well, we have a problem with limbs here. Why is it the perch's fins have such different form and development from the other groups closer to it compared to the salamander, while the salamander has those same limbs? Similarly, amphibians have things like a neck, which is shared by the birds and other tetrapods on here, but not by the perch. So I guess perch never developed limbs or a neck, but amniotes and amphibians developed developmentally identical necks and limbs. Again, this is not a parsimonious result. Well, last but not least, let's try hagfish and the lizard. Essentially, we have the same problems with legs and necks and fins as before, but now we have to wonder how the hagfish also lost a bony skeleton and jaws entirely, while its closest relative, the birds, did not, or how it managed to re-evolve gills, while the lizard just happened to evolve all the traits of amniotes, despite being less closely related to them than is a ray-fin fish. See, that's the thing, you can't just draw any shape under these. There is only one way to arrange these that actually fits with the data, and it's so obvious that this is the case that this idea predates Darwin by 124 years. Carolus Linnaeus, from whom we get the term Linnaean taxonomy, noticed that there were objectively nested hierarchies in living things that are unlike those found in man-made things, and he described most of the taxa in plants and animals that are still being used, including things like aves, mammalia, carnivora, primates, etc. The relationship between Linnaeus and Darwin is like that between Newton and Einstein. Linnaeus and Newton noticed a consistent pattern in nature and described it in a way that remains useful even today, although in some details we need to make corrections to both. Darwin and Einstein both came up with a theoretical framework to explain these patterns in nature. Newton observed that mass was attracted to mass proportional to the sum of the masses, and inversely proportional to the distance between them. Einstein realized that this was because mass curves space-time towards itself, and that objects follow the geodesic of a local curvature of space-time, which results in masses falling towards each other, with a force proportional to their sum mass and inversely proportional to their distance. Linnaeus realized that there were right and wrong ways to organize living things, and that all living things fell into an objective nested hierarchy, where any member of a lower taxa was also a member of all higher taxa, but he didn't know why. Darwin realized that it was because these taxa actually represent the descendants of common ancestors, and so no matter how far into the future a taxon goes, since it can't ever evolve to not be a descendant of its ancestors, nature automatically produces these nested hierarchies by descent with modification. Playing with tools in your garage or the silverware in your kitchen will not get you anything close to this, no matter how much creationists would like to whine that it does.
Or you might not have them linking up at all.
Now that's an interesting idea. What if there were no objectively more correct way to arrange organisms? Which is what we should expect if they do not share common ancestry, just common design. We might have bats with feathery wings or lizards with lion teeth. That will result in an inability to link organisms. And if that were to be the case, any phylogenetic analysis run on such organisms would simply return only extremely low confidence trees, because the point of statistics run on such trees is to show how likely a tree is to have been generated randomly, rather than being an actual representation of the relationship between the organisms. In a case where organisms were not related, then such trees should all return being far more likely to be chance than not. The very fact that this does not occur means that life absolutely is arranged the way that we would expect if shared common ancestry were true, and is absolutely not arranged the way we might expect it if it was not true. Unless the creator just wanted to fool us into thinking it did evolve. Since I prefer not to let an omnipotent liar into my epistemology for the sake of, even having an epistemology, I must reject that option out of hand. The universe is to be treated as if God, should he exist, is not lying to us. And so the very fact that concordant high-confidence trees can be constructed is evidence of the reality of common descent.
I just want to emphasize, I want you to understand that the whole scientific community went berserk over the idea of making these trees. And so tens of thousands of scientists spent their whole career making these trees. They made hundreds of thousands of trees. I remember being in the Cornell Library and just paging through the biology journals, and it was just one after another of these trees.
Yeah, it's almost like this is the basic unifying idea of biology. It's like being surprised to see stratigraphic columns in geology papers or stellar spectra in astronomy papers.
All these data points. There is data here. These aren't just pretend.
How magnanimous of him to mention.
But they're just measuring similarities and differences between living things. And then they're drawing lines, which are just educated guesses.
Backed up by data, but whatever. Sanford's just repeating himself here. We'll come back after he gets to a new point.
Now, the problem with this is that, like I said, you can make a phylogeny of any set of objects. Go into the kitchen, take the utensils drawer, dump it out, and then look at all the stuff that's in there, all kinds of interesting things, and you'll notice that some things are more similar than others. And so if you take 10 different people and have them categorize these and start making measurements of how different and similar things are, what you'd have is each one of them would come up with their own groupings, And each one of them would have their own history of where utensils came from.
So do it. Seriously, creationists, I'm so sick of this claim that you never actually back up. Write up that paper complete with all your data and all your math on kitchenware phylogenetics. Show what kinds of p-values you get on your parsimony-based phylogenetics, etc. See if it's reproducible. Then compare notes with the same thing being done in evolution. If you can get the same level of statistical significance, then you can say that maybe you have a point that high-confidence phylogenetic analysis is just silliness, since you can get that reproducibly with stuff in your kitchen drawer. I'm waiting. I already showed that you can't just arrange organisms randomly into a phylogeny, and that's something we've known about for about 3 centuries. So you've had a long time to do the same thing with man-made objects, and yet you haven't. You don't even try. This is the laziest bullshit the creationists pull. Stop pretending that it's my job to test your shit and go do it yourself if you're so damn confident. But we know you won't, because either right on the surface you're just dishonest, or deep down in your consciousness where you don't like to look because that's the part that has doubts, you suspect it's all nonsense, and you can't let yourself think about that. And this, of course, ignores the simple fact that we can watch both new species come about and new kitchenware items, and they don't do it in the same way. Organisms observably evolve in real time before our eyes. Forks and spoons are observably made in human factories. If forks could fornicate and produce babies which inherit traits from both parents with the new variations, then maybe this might be an interesting analogy. But they don't, and you all know it.
And so some of them would say egg beaters came from spoons. And others would say, no, egg beaters came from chopsticks. But you see, it just depends on what measurements they chose to take.
Yeah, that would happen with kitchen gadgets. Weird then how you give phylogeneticists, a group of animals like hagfish, a perch, a salamander, a lizard, a pigeon, and a mouse, and a chimpanzee, and they all manage to get the same phylogeny. Weird then how even when they disagree about the placement of a branch here or there is still a wide consensus. This isn't a whole contingent of scientists arguing that apes are actually closer to elephants than they are to capybaras. They all agree that they're way closer to capybaras. No one is wondering whether a falcon is more like a parrot or a chickadee. Everyone knows it's the parrot. No one has to scratch their head about if an aardwolf is a hyena or a fox. Everyone in the field knows it's a hyena. Why is that? Why is there such broad agreement if, like Sanford says, you can just draw whatever tree under the animals you want depending on what measurements you take? Like you can with kitchenware. It's almost like this whole claim is nonsense, and the kind of thing it doesn't take a PhD in biology to figure out.
And that's exactly what's seen with these biological phylogenies, is depending on who's making the tree and what measurements they choose to take to measure similarities and differences, they keep getting the same.
They keep getting the same results. Yes, they do. Why is he lying about that?
Analyzing the same objects and getting different phylogenetic trees.
Oh, it was a Freudian slip. Yeah, that checks out. Pretty obvious Sanford knows better and is just lying for Jesus. You know, if your theology were true, you wouldn't have to lie about verifiable facts to support it. Just saying.
Because it's highly arbitrary.
Except, it's not, because in many cases, phylogenetic analyses are highly reproducible. This is in contrast to the creation equivalent, baraminology, which has a serious problem with reproducibility because, spoiler alert, the people doing baraminology as a rule don't care what's true, they're seeking to confirm what they already think is true.
By God's grace, in 2009, a new scientist came out with an issue that dealt with this problem in depth. And here's the cover of their issue. And it says on the cover of the New Scientist, Darwin was wrong. And it says, cutting down the tree of life. And basically, the whole article talks about our inability to create a legitimate tree of life and know who came from what and how they might have had a common ancestor.
Good to know you're lying about this source, too.
You a rotten liar.
So what's this actually talking about? Well, it's noting that at the base of the tree of life, horizontal gene transfer, that is, exchange of genetic material from relatively unrelated organisms during the course of an organism's life and not associated with any instance of reproduction, was so prevalent that it becomes hard to create branching diagrams. And here's the thing, that's a real problem, and it may not have an easy solution. But you know what it's not about? Anything that could be a problem for ideas like the universal ancestry of all eukaryotes. That is everything from an amoeba to a mushroom to a pine tree to an elephant. But Sanford here needs to disrupt common ancestry of humans and chimpanzees, pointing out that the neat branching phylogenies are hard to make when the taxa under consideration are things like all organisms with a nucleus and all bacteria, doesn't in any way negate the extremely high confidence of, say, primate phylogenies, which routinely and reproducibly connect humans and genus Pan as sister lineages, and that group as a sister to gorilla. As an analogy, imagine if you're trying to follow a cake recipe, but Sanford comes out and asks you if you can explain the entire life cycle and nitrogen fixation path of Klebsiella pneumoniae, and says that if you can't, then you should probably stop baking a cake because it's impossible. You, being not a completely insane person, ask him,
"What the f*** are you talking about?"
He responds, well, a study pointed out that a particular species of bacteria provides nitrogen fixation to wheat, and without that, wheat couldn't grow, and then you wouldn't get flour to bake your cake. Of course, your response is that it doesn't really matter at this point how the process of making a cake started that far back in the process. You have flour, eggs, salt, butter, baking powder, sugar, vanilla, and milk, and that no matter where all that came from at this point, they will combine just fine into a cake batter, which will bake up into a cake, and that every time someone gets all these ingredients, combines them in the same amounts, and bakes them the same way, they get a cake. Of course, Sanford says you're just being arbitrary, and then you tell him to leave your kitchen, or you'll have him arrested for trespassing and criminal stupidity. Maybe I shouldn't be writing the script before breakfast. Anyway, even if we were all to accept that this trouble way at the base of the Tree of Life meant that those areas where there are no simple consensus trees mean that there was no common ancestry, it still leaves us with humans sharing common ancestry with jellyfish.
So the latest research shows that the Tree of Life, Darwin's Tree of Life, is coming down.
Is it though, or does it just have a confusing root structure?
And so here's one of the people who was a scientist who was interviewed in that article was a famous phylogenists named Doolittle, and they were citing an earlier paper called Uprooting the Tree of Life, published in Scientific American.
Oh look, a chart showing exactly what I said, that it's crazy and complicated because of horizontality right at the base, but that after that it continues up without such chaos. Good to know for sure that Mr. Sanford is just a liar.
And this is his view of the Tree of Life. He said, it's a hopeless mess. You can't see a branching structure. It's just a tangle. And he called it the web of life. What he means is there's no way to decipher what that branching structure, historically, what the branching structure was.
Yeah, but he's not saying that about what comes after the base. We can all tell this is just lies. Let's just sample some of the text, shall we? From the opening section we get, to everyone's surprise, discoveries made in the past few years have begun to cast serious doubt on some aspects of the tree, especially on the depiction of the relationships near the root. Interesting. On page 94, closer to the end of the article, we have, if there had never been any lateral transfer, all these individual gene trees would have the same topology, the same branching order, and the ancestral genes at the root of each tree would have all been present in the genome of the last universal common ancestor, a single ancient cell. But extensive transfer means that neither is the case. Gene trees will differ, although many will have regions of similar topology, and there would never have been a single cell that could be called the last universal common ancestor. Gee, it's almost like all of this is so far upstream of what Sanford needs it to be that it's pointless, and still, even the authors don't think that this is actually showing the consensus tree has nothing to it, just that many genes have a different tree because of all this horizontal gene transfer. And in the conclusion on page 95 we read, the ancestor cannot have been a particular organism or a single organismal lineage. It was communal, a loosely knit, diverse conglomeration of primitive cells that evolved as a unit, and it eventually developed to a stage where it broke into several distinct communities, which in turn become the three primary lines of descent, bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. Oh, so after this initial high rate of universal horizontal gene transfer, we got distinct lineages, not a continuation of the confusing patterns. Gee, funny how so far every source Sanford has used would disagree with not only his conclusions, but even what the source itself is trying to say. It's almost like he's a dishonest hack, but what do I know? I'm just a Ceratosaurus. I bite the head off of sauropods.
Stephen Jay Gould.
Nope, we're not doing another Stephen Jay Gould quote mine. Sanford has too often lied about his sources, including already about Gould. We're not letting him drag Gould's corpse through the mud again on this channel. That's enough disrespect for Gould for one video series. The first time was already disgusting enough, and yeah, Sanford, if you're watching, you are a disgusting little toad who has to blatantly lie to be taken seriously. It's just Gould saying the same thing about how at the base of a tree many genes have phylogenetic trees. That does not have the same topology as the consensus tree for the lineages as a whole. And yeah, not only is that true, it doesn't help Sanford's case at all.
You know, in the textbooks it make it looks like these trees are scientific and that they're proof.
They are scientific. because they were constructed according to the scientific method and are reproducible to a high degree. But they are not proof, they are the conclusions of studies. When virtually anyone looks at the data and tries to figure it out, they get the same tree, which becomes a consensus. I'm still waiting for that level of rigor and reproducibility from Sanford's promised kitchenware phylogeny paper.
In reality, similarities and differences in the present don't tell us the past.
Some of my audience might be familiar with the fact that websites exist that collect genealogical information such as census results, birth records, baptismal records, etc. from around the world, and that not all of them are even run by Mormons. You might also know that some of them offer DNA testing, and that the results, in addition to being mailed to the customer, are kept in a database, which also allows them to alert people when their relatives upload DNA, especially if those relatives are not yet linked on a genealogy. When this happens, the two individuals can compare genealogical notes and are often able to find a previously unknown common ancestor, such as a great-great-grandparent. This is entirely based on the same idea as phylogenies, especially molecular phylogenies, which concentrate on things like protein sequence and genetics. If current genetic similarities did not give evidence of past events, then how is it that people can use their genetic data to find relatives on that basis alone, and then also find out exactly how they are related, complete with a name, a birth date, and a death date in many cases for their common ancestor? Of course, this process can use present data to tell us about the past, and it does so routinely, not just in genealogical research, but also in forensics when crimes have been committed. Criminals have been identified without having the criminal's DNA, but only that of a relative. Similarly, the case of the Somerton man was recently solved with the help of DNA, although at the time of this writing, the South Australia police have not confirmed this. The Somerton man case concerned the body of an unidentified man who washed ashore on the beach at Somerton Park near Adelaide, South Australia. He had no ID on him, and no one came forward to identify him. There was much speculation about him, and possibly a nurse that he may have had an affair with, as her son had genetic peculiarities that he also shared. This hypothesis on its own is based on the fact that we can see current similarities and infer past events. Fortunately for the world, when a plaster cast was made of the Somerton man's bust in hopes that it might someday be used to identify him, some of his hair was left behind in the bust. Professor Derek Abbott and genealogist Colleen M. Fitzpatrick got access to this hair and used DNA analysis along with genealogical DNA databases to finally identify the man as Charles Webb. This was done by also getting DNA samples from potential descendants and relatives to compare against. So, is Sanford right that all of this is nonsense? No, of course not. We all know that DNA is evidence of ancestry. So how far back do we go? Can the DNA matches between all humans be used to infer universal human common ancestry? Well, I should think so, and Sanford would agree. But the same data shows that humans share common ancestry with all primates. And when I say it shows it, let me quote some of the paper's statistical evidence for common ancestry, application to primates by Baum et al., published in Evolution on May 3, 2016. This is from the discussion. Every test of species separate ancestry that we applied to the primates suggested that this model does a very poor job of explaining actual biological data as compared to common ancestry. Many of these datasets reject species separate ancestry strongly. The probability of obtaining a test statistic more extreme than the one observed under the species separate ancestry model being incredibly small, often approaching or greatly exceeding the probability of picking the correct atom at random among the estimated 10 to the 80th atoms in the known universe. This uniform and strong signal arises in part from the large number of primate species for which data is available. In the case of family separate ancestry, the fact that there are only 16 living primate families greatly reduces statistical power. Nonetheless, except in cases where we studied a single trait across families, e.g. chromosome number, testes relative weight, etc., tests of family separate ancestry have showed extremely strong support for common ancestry. When they talk about these statistics, they have used p-values. P-value can be thought of as the chance that the data in question happens to support the hypothesis simply by random chance. The smaller it is, the more strongly the hypothesis is accepted, and the more strongly the null hypothesis, in this case separate ancestry, that is special creation, is rejected. In some cases, the p-value reported is 0. In other words, so small that their statistical methods cannot recover values that small. When they can, they get numbers like 10 to the negative 1,700. That is a 0 followed by a decimal point, followed by 1,700 zeros, then a 1. That's the chance of separate ancestry being the cause of the observed data. Finally, the last paragraph is, in writing this article, we hope to stimulate more work on statistical evidence for common ancestry, not because there is any scientific doubt about the veracity of common ancestry, but because the effort to formally test this hypothesis can only sharpen our understanding of the nature of the supporting evidence. Furthermore, We hope that this work will lead to a statistical and philosophical analysis of the similarities and differences between the inference of common ancestry and other historical claims, ranging from those that are conceptually very similar to common ancestry, such as common ancestry of languages, to those that are quite different, such as the Big Bang and continental drift. By looking across different historical sciences and their sources of evidence that they use in support of accepted claims, we may hope that a general theory of statistical history may emerge. Thus, we hope that this article will not just stimulate further philosophical and statistical research on evidence for common ancestry, but also on broader questions in historical inference. So yeah, this paper wasn't even done because there was any scientific doubt about common ancestry of all primates. It's just that it's fun to think about, and yeah, it's low-key, but this paper was absolutely written to show up creationist hacks like Sanford. So, sure seems like we can use the same types of evidence we use to identify bodies in cold cases, catch killers, and find our long-lost cousins in the modern day, to also say, with even more certainty than I've ever seen in any scientific paper before, that humans are related to lemurs.
And so we're going back to Darwin's I think, and he has a little cartoon. It was just a cartoon.
Still not a cartoon.
But the thing to know is that now the cartoons are much more sophisticated.
Again, they're not cartoons, asshole, but yeah, they're based on data now.
But all those colored lines and dots are still just in the imagination of the researcher.
Funny, because everything we've been shown so far actually said quite the opposite.
And guess what? They still should say, I think.
Effectively, they do, because they're all hypotheses formed as a result of the collected data. Science isn't in the habit that Sanford is of coming to an absolute conclusion. It's one of the reasons I think Sanford can no longer be called a scientist. He has dogmatic conclusions about science reached for reasons other than the evidence that he will use as an excuse to disguise and mutilate any data that don't conform to his conclusion until they do.
And that would really change the way people look at that literature, a body of literature that is truly massive.
No, it wouldn't, because all the people who actually know what they're talking about and who talk about it honestly know that these are hypotheses derived as the conclusion of a study.
Darwin was wrong about the nature of life.
Place your bets now. Will Sanford be honest about his sources and use sources that support rather than refute his claims?
This is huge. This is so big.
It's the best argument. Like you wouldn't believe. No one has arguments like this. And people, they tell me, they say, these arguments are immense. So trust me, we have the arguments, no matter what the media says.
So we have a picture of Darwin, and he's imagining a cell, as you might have seen a cell in his time frame, when microscopes were very poor. So it's a little bit of out of focus, and it just looks like a little blob of jelly, doesn't it?
Which isn't how we know cells to be, and which is why we don't listen to what Darwin had to say about cellular biology. Weird how science still, this far in, doesn't care at all about Darwin and what he said on the grounds that he said it, and is perfectly happy to ignore Darwin when we know he was wrong.
And so this was actually his understanding of life. Life was very simple. Basically, each cell was not much more than a blob of jelly. And so here's a quote from him that shows us how simple he thought life was. So he's imagining what it would be like, how life originally arose spontaneously. So let's see how he envisions that. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive. Now you understand he's entering into the realm of imagination.
Yeah, as Sanford himself said, thinking about the problem that you want to use science to solve is basically the first step. It's nice that imagination is bad when Darwin does it, but when scientists who aren't currently obviously threatening Sanford's obviously nonsense beliefs are doing it, that's okay. And who's ready for a dumb and irrelevant discussion of abiogenesis and what Darwin thought about it?
But let's see just how interesting his imagination is. In some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts. Well, guess what? There are warm little ponds all over the world, and they all have ammonia and phosphoric salts. That's not a remarkable possibility.
Exactly. That's why Darwin said it. He was trying to explain why he thought that the first formation of a living organism via natural mechanisms wasn't as impossible as people might think. So of course he points out some relatively common conditions that could be imagined as existing on a prebiotic Earth.
But he adds, with light, heat, electricity, etc.
Oh no, you mean Darwin might have known that life needed energy? What a dummy.
Well, etc. Light, heat, and electricity, they're everywhere. It's kind of vague, isn't it?
Of course it is. It's 1871. No one had anything but the vaguest idea of how biochemistry worked, never mind had a coherent model for abiogenesis. This is just the very basics of the idea. Next, he'll be complaining that Newton didn't manage to figure out the Schrödinger equation, and then using that to invalidate all of quantum mechanics.
So we have a pond and some chemicals and maybe some electricity. And now he imagines that a protein, now you have to understand he didn't know what a protein was, or apparently even how to spell it.
Oh, so someone in the days before spell check misspelled a word in a handwritten letter. Let's see if we can get Sanford to handwrite several pages worth of text about a technical subject with no spelling mistakes. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that he'll fail that test, as would I. But Darwin had a notion of what a protein was, but no, he didn't know all the chemistry behind what proteins were. But is that the case now? No, of course not, because unless Sanford knew that he knew better than Darwin, he wouldn't mention this. But that on its own betrays the pointlessness of this whole exercise, because modern abiogenetic research isn't based on some letter Darwin wrote in the 1870s.
But he's mad, he knows that proteins are kind of these gooey, ooey things, and so he's mad a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. So what does that mean? It's like, it's really laughable, because he's, let me just try to.
Ha ha, dead man thought wrong thing, ha ha ha. Let's just remind ourselves of the scientific quality of the text that Sanford is using as his absolute literal truth, to which all facts must cohere. This is Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 through 43.
After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages, and I will pay them." Jacob said to him, "You know I have worked for you, and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future. Whenever you check on the wages you have paid me, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flocks by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels and donkeys.
Gee, that all seems like it's ignoring most of what we know about genetics in the modern day. I guess all ideas derived from the Bible are nonsense, using Sanford's own logic.
Emphasize what most of you have already gathered. Life is a universe of complexity. A single cell is a universe of complexity that we can't even grasp with our minds.
It sure is, like after 3 billion years of evolution. But was it 3 billion years ago? I don't know, but I don't have any good reason to think it was.
And so he's talking about a protein compound. Let me just explain to you, if the world was made of solid protein.
I can immediately tell this is about to be unimaginably dumb.
And the oceans were chock full of proteins of every imaginable kind, we would be no closer to having spontaneous life on Earth than if there were no proteins.
What are we even talking about? I expected this to be, at least, an idea?
Proteins are not the basis of life. Life requires an unbelievably complex arrangement of very specific organic molecules and programmed information.
got a citation for that there, Dr. Sanford? Because I don't think you do. I think that's just a bald assertion with nothing to back it up. Especially the word programmed, which is just begging the question about a designer, presumably a divine one, being involved. And can I point out that just like with the last point about the trouble with figuring out consensus phylogeny at the root of the tree of life, that even if abiogenesis were completely impossible and it required divine action to get the first life, it still leaves humans being genetically related to jellyfish, never mind just other primates. To any creationist who might be listening, especially Sanford or Sal Cordova, arguing about things like this sounds to everyone else like you're claiming that the sun is not actually a ball of plasma fusing hydrogen, but it's just a big galactic diode getting its energy from current flow originating from the center of the galaxy, and then backing up by pointing out that there is a divergence in the age of the universe estimates based on various sources. Like, even if that's true, it doesn't get you one iota closer to your actual central thesis. It's useless arguing about the fringe of a different topic. If your conclusion reaches humans aren't apes, and you want to putz about with Darwin's ideas on abiogenesis or protein families, you might as well be off in your room sucking your own thumb for all the good it's going to do young Earth creationism.
A single cell is like a city, and its information system is comparable to the internet, and its energy system is like a city's energy grid, and its mechanical design allows it to duplicate the whole system.
Fun fact, no matter how many analogies we get, it doesn't make complexity imply design on its own.
A little protein is not the solution.
Good thing that no origin of life researchers think that the answers to the puzzles of abiogenesis is a protein, then, isn't it?
Darwin's challenge said, if I could demonstrate that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would break down completely. But I can find no such case. Well, why couldn't he find such a case?
There were no such cases known then, and there are no such cases known now. That's why. But I did notice that we've gone from abiogenesis to the origin of organs with no mention of the fact that these are very different things. Slick Sanford, very dishonest and very slick.
Well, let's see. Darwin lived before the biological revolution. He knew nothing about biology.
Liar! Liar!
So if he looked at a high school biology textbook today, he couldn't make any sense of it.
That's not true at all. Much of it was already known by him, like the function of most organs, the basic shape of taxonomy, etc. Sanford is just being needlessly disrespectful to a man who, and I'll keep saying it, doesn't really matter to science at this point.
If he opened up a journal today, he wouldn't understand the first sentence. Be fair to him. Yes, he lived before the biological revolution.
Which is why his views are of historical, not scientific interest. But remind me, what do the current crop of biologists who do live after the biological revolution think of Sanford's ideas? Oh right, they write tongue-in-cheek papers pointing out how batshit they are when they bother to even acknowledge that such lunacy still exists. Basically, they treat Sanford the way that doctors treat people, suggesting that the right way to treat the next pandemic is bloodletting or burning doves on an altar. Okay, that's about as much as I can take in a day. If you liked this video, please hit like and leave a comment telling me what you liked. If you didn't like it, hit dislike and tell me why not in the comments. Either way, I hope you subscribe and use the notification bell to turn on all notifications so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above.
Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Vantovent, Tapioca Weasel, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Elleron Teller, and Pat L. Dennis.
As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.